channel, as you said. Okay.
Thank you.
I'm joined today by Dr. Christopher Kaiser, who is professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. He was appointed a William E. Simon Visiting Fellow in the James Madison Program at Princeton University, and he was a Fulbright Scholar and Alexander von Humboldt Federal Chancellor Fellow. The winner of a Templeton Grant. He's written more than 100 scholarly articles and book chapters, and he is an award-winning author who's written over 15 books, including Disputes in Bioethics and The Ethics of Abortion, Women's Rights, Human Life, and the Question of Justice, which is now in its third edition, which we'll be discussing in this episode. Christopher Kaiser, welcome to the Classical Theism Podcast.
Thank you, John. I'm really happy to be talking with you today.
So how did you get interested in studying ethics at such a deep level? Give us a few highlights of your own backstory.
Well, it started a long time ago. It started in fourth grade, actually. I snuck out of my house and met my fifth grade friend, and we were chatting together. And I don't know how this came up. He was the sixth of six children, and somehow the topic of abortion came up. And he said to me, "Well, hold it. Are you trying to tell me that you think a single cell zygote is really a human being?" And I thought to myself, well, no, I wouldn't say that. No, not a single cell zygote. No. And he goes, okay, well, fine. What about like 2 or 3 or 4 cells? That's barely different than a single cell zygote. I said, okay, I see that. And he said, well, look, defending abortion is just like that. You're just talking about some cells. They're not even really human being. And so, what's the problem with that? And I wasn't sure what the problem with that was. So I started, kind of wondering about things, and I just wasn't sure about that. And about the same time, I went to summer camp, and I went into the restroom, and on the wall there, it said, can God make a rock that he cannot lift? And I thought, I don't know. If I say yes, God can make a rock that he cannot lift, well, then it sounds like something's greater than God, but God is supposed to be that than which nothing greater can be thought. On the other hand, if I say God cannot make a rock he can't lift, well, then God doesn't seem to be omnipotent. He's not all powerful. So that seems wrong. So I just didn't know what to think. And so Plato said that philosophy begins in wonder. And so I guess my career as a philosopher began with wondering about this question of, can God make a rock he can't lift? And wondering about this question too of, well, what is the ethics of abortion? Is it true that a single celled zygote isn't a human being? And so I guess I was pretty young when I started thinking about these kinds of questions. And of course, I thought about it when I was in fourth grade, like fourth graders think about questions. But basically, questions have kind of animated me all the way till today. Now, I have different questions now than I did in fourth grade, but I'm still somebody who just asks questions and tries to figure out the answers and look at what other people have said about these issues. And so that's kind of how I got into all this, I guess.
No, it's a great backstory and springboard into philosophy. I love that notion that it begins in wonder. I think that's huge. And I think a lot of young people are natural philosophers. It sometimes gets beaten out of them, maybe just with the mundane tests and quizzes and high school studies. But if you just kind of let them wonder about things, they're going to have good questions. So I'm glad you took it into a path in philosophy. And your latest book, which we're talking about today, The Ethics of Abortion, forthcoming in its third edition, it makes a really comprehensive pro-life case. So we're gonna get into that in a little bit later. But first, can you just give us an overview of the book and some of the new material in this latest edition?
Yeah, the book is aiming to be a comprehensive analysis of the ethics of abortion. I do touch on the legal questions about abortion. Obviously, with Roe versus Wade being overturned, the legal questions are very much questions that people are asking. But I do think that we can't really adequately tackle even the legal issues unless we have at least implicitly some ethical framework and understanding, because these two things really do go together. So in the book, what I do is I start off with common ground. I start off with things that everybody can agree to. So everybody would agree that, John, you and I have a right to live. That is to say, if someone were to burst into your studio right now and kill you, that person would do something seriously wrong. And we have this right to live yesterday and last week and last year. So everybody pro-choice and pro-life agrees to that. Now, the question is, when does this arise? So the most radical answer that's given to that is by people like Peter Singer and Michael Tooley, and they will say that the right to live begins after birth. And there's a little bit of a debate about exactly when it begins, a week after birth, maybe a month after birth. There's a famous article called After Birth Abortion, Should the Baby Live? And the authors in that article say that the right to live begins when an individual is conscious of his or her own existence and also desires to live. Now, human self-consciousness arises around the age of 2. That's when human beings begin to be able to pass the mirror test. The mirror test is when you put a little mark on someone's forehead and they look in the mirror and they say, oh, that's me in the mirror. Whereas, say, dogs don't pass the mirror test. If you have a dog seeing itself in a mirror, the dog's going to think it's another dog and kind of, play or fight or whatever. But the dog doesn't recognize that, oh, that's me in the mirror. So if that view is right, then we'd have post-birth abortion or infanticide up to around the age of 2. Now, if you're mentally handicapped, it would be even later, but, ballpark for most normally developing human beings around the age of 2. And then, you in the book, what I do is I move backwards, right? So that's one extreme answer. But then other people say, well, it's the moment of birth. And I look at the arguments given in favor of that, and I find those arguments wanting. And then another view would be, well, it's sometime during gestation, right? So it's before birth, sometime during pregnancy. And there's a whole bunch of markers there. So some people would say, well, it's when you are sentient, when you begin to have the ability to experience suffering and pain in utero. And then there's some debate about exactly when that is. Some people will say, well, that's very late in pregnancy, 32 weeks. Some people say, no, it's very early in pregnancy, about 7 weeks. So there's some debate. But the idea is whenever you can experience suffering. And then other people would say it's viability. And viability is defined as the ability to live outside of the uterus with artificial help. Now, the line of viability now is about 23 weeks or so, 22 weeks. It depends on technology, of course. Scientists are now working on means of pushing that line back all the way to conception, but now it's about 22, 23 weeks. Other people would say, no, when the right to life begins is at the point where there's conscious desires in utero. That's the view of David Boonin. And then some people would push it back even further and say it's the beginning whenever there's a brain that's present. And so anyway, there's a bunch of different views that say that our right to live began when we were in utero. And then the view that I think is correct is that our right to live began when we began to exist. And we're human beings, we're organisms of a particular kind, and we come into existence at conception. Unless we are a twin, in which case we come to existence at the point of twinning. Then the book handles another whole way of defending abortion, which is sometimes called the violinist argument. So on this view, you'd say that human beings, even if they have a right to life all the way from conception, abortion is still ethically permissible because abortion would be akin to detaching yourself from a violinist. And so I look at the violinist argument and the burglar argument, a bunch of different arguments that are like that. A famous variation of that is the idea that you shouldn't be forced to donate organs. So there's a famous legal case in which one cousin sued another cousin to force the cousin to donate his organ. And the judge threw that out and said you can't be forced to do that. So the idea is that being pregnant would be akin to being forced to donate your organs to support the fetal life. So that's the basic plan of the book. And I talk also about conscience protections and about use of artificial wombs as a possible solution in the debate about abortion. But that's kind of the basic outline
Yeah.
of the book. Yeah.
No, that's a great outline. It's like you said, it is very comprehensive, and we're going to get back to those topics because I know one of my listeners wanted to ask you about the violinist argument, and I have another question about artificial wombs that I want to bring up. So we are definitely going to get into those details for people sticking around. But I wanted to start out with a different question because the topic of abortion is oftenly it's a very emotionally charged issue, especially in our current moment, like you mentioned in the United States of overturning Roe versus Wade. So before we get jump into the pro-life case, in your view, what, if anything, does the pro-choice side get right?
Well, I would say the pro-choice side arises from something very right in terms of motivation. So everyone that I've met who is in favor of abortion is doing this out of a good motivation. In other words, they want to help women. They feel that abortion is a way in which women can secure their well-being and secure a better future for themselves. And so that motivation is one that I 100% agree with, and I think is 100% right. I think that all human beings, male or female, young or old, deserve respect, deserve protection by the laws, that we should not only protect and defend all human beings, but I think we should even try to love all human beings. And if you love someone, what that means for me is you will the good for that person. You want them to have a good life. You want them to be happy. You want them to be healthy. You want them to have friends. You want them to have knowledge. You want them to have good things. And secondly, that you appreciate the good that they have. So if you have a friend who's intelligent, you appreciate that person's intelligence. If you have a friend who's athletic, you appreciate that they're good at sports. So the idea is that you have goodwill for the person, you appreciate the person, and you are united with the person. So for me, even though I care a lot, obviously, about the ethics of abortion, I have never allowed differences of view on this topic to be an impediment to friendship. In fact, the person with whom I've talked the most about this issue was my college roommate. And we had different views on this, and we debated for, literally years about it. But he was the best man in my wedding, and I was the best man in his wedding, and we're still very good friends. We just talked this week, actually. So I think even though this issue is very clearly a central, important issue, I feel very much goodwill towards those that have different opinions on this topic, and I recognize that they're motivated in a very positive way. They want to help people. They want to make the world a better place, and we have a disagreement about what exactly is going to make the world a better place and what exactly is the right way to help people. But I think that a fundamental respect for interlocutors in this debate is quite important.
No, and I think you maintain that tone of respect clearly in your book. And sometimes it might be a nice piece of common ground in conversation to just acknowledge that we acknowledge that, hey, your motivations here of helping women, wanting people to have better lives, those are good things. We're on board with that too. And then explain, perhaps why we disagree. So let's get into that because I want to get to the pro-life case. And first, I thought I'd just give you some space, as much as you need, maybe 5-10 minutes to lay out like a general case. And then we'll get into some of those more sticky issues, the tough circumstances, objections, and so on. But why should we be pro-life? Why should we hold, as you say, that all intentional abortions are ethically wrong?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of ways to think about this issue. And so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to summarize everything I say in the book, of course, but I'll just kind of summarize maybe a couple brief ideas. Let's start off with a basic idea of why would it be wrong to kill you or to kill me? Presumably, everybody would agree that's wrong. Now, why is it wrong? Well, the atheist Don Marcus brought forward a very interesting argument why it's wrong to kill you or me. If we get killed today, that doesn't take away our past. I still had a nice experience in graduate school. I still have friends that I care about. So my past can't really be taken away by anybody. But if someone kills you or me today, what they do is they take away our chance for a valuable future. So if I get killed today, I won't be able to enjoy meeting new friends in the future. I won't be able to learn new things. I won't be able to appreciate the beauty of nature, the beauty of art. So I'll be deprived of the chance to enjoy all these future goods. And the same thing's true about killing you. If you get killed today, you'll be deprived of the goods you would have enjoyed tomorrow, next week, next year, etc. Now, the very same thing is true of killing a human newborn. If we kill a newborn baby, that baby is not going to be able to go to kindergarten, is not going to be able to meet friends and play soccer and, eat pizza and, do all the things that that child would have done if we hadn't taken away that child's chance for a valuable future. The same thing's true not only of killing a newborn, but of killing a prenatal human being. If we kill that individual is not going to be able to go to kindergarten, play on the playground, learn how to read and write, grow up, get married, have children. All the goods that that child would have enjoyed are taken away. They're deprived of the chance of having a valuable future. So for the very same reason that it's wrong to kill you or me, it's wrong to kill a newborn baby, it's wrong to kill a human being in utero. And so this way of thinking about it, as you can see, isn't theological. Nothing I said relies on faith or relies on revelation or the Bible or the Quran or the teaching of Buddha or anything like that. Any person of goodwill can come to understand that it's wrong to kill you or me. And I think all people of goodwill accept that already, right? And why is it wrong to kill you or me? Well, one reason, maybe not the only reason, but one reason is that it deprives us of our chance for a valuable future. That's one kind of argument that
Sure.
I'm attracted to. But let me talk about another kind of argument I'm attracted to also. When we look back at history, we see many times that we've divided the human family into two groups. And we've said, well, if you're like me, well, then you deserve basic rights and respect. If you're like me, then you deserve the protections of the law and you deserve fundamental human rights. But if you're not like me, well, I'm sorry, you don't really count. And so we look back at the Supreme Court in its famous Dred Scott case. And it said, well, if you're like us, the Supreme Court, the white Supreme Court justices, well, then you have basic rights under the law. But if you're Black, you don't really have that. You're not fully a person, right? If we look at European explorers who exploited native peoples, they said, well, if you're like us, if you're European, you have basic rights. But if you're a native person, you don't really have that. In other times and places, people have said, well, if you're a man, you have basic rights. But if you're a woman, no, you don't really, can't own property, can't vote, can't do whatever. So I've noticed that whenever we divide the human family into two groups, those that have basic human rights and those that don't have basic human rights, whenever we've done this, we've made a terrible, terrible mistake. And I feel that we're doing the exact same thing today. Today we say, well, if you're like me, if you're born, if you're an adult, well, then you have basic human rights. But if you're preborn, well, you don't really count. Or another view is if you're born, but you're under the age of 2, well, then you don't really count. But I think every single time we've ever divided the human family into these two groups, we've made a terrible, terrible mistake. And so I think we'd be wise to have an ethics of inclusivity, where we say everybody counts. Because every time we've practiced an ethics of exclusivity, we've always made a horrible mistake.
Okay, I think those are two good springboard arguments to get the conversation going. Following up on the second one, though, I think we have to be a little bit more clear about what exactly do you mean by the ethics of inclusivity as far as who should be included. For example, I don't necessarily think we would say that certain animals need to be included. So where do you draw that line as far as who is a member of our family? I guess you said human, and would the early stages of an embryo or a fetus count as part of that human family, as you say?
Yeah. The question of animal rights is a very important one, but I don't think it's a question that we need to answer in order to come to a conclusion about the ethics of abortion. It seems to me you could have a very strong animal rights view and say that all animals deserve basic human rights. But if you had that, then you'd say, well, the human fetus, the human newborn is clearly an animal of some kind, and so they should be included as deserving basic respect. My own view is kind of neutral on the question of whether or not animals have basic human rights, because it seems to me you could have either include a lot of animals, include some animals, or not, and still come to the pro-life view. Now, when we talk about human rights, what does that mean? Well, I would say That is similar to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which says that all human beings deserve basic human rights. Now, I say basic. Why? Well, because there are some rights that are in addition to our basic human rights. Like think of the right to drive a car. That is not a basic human right. Why? Well, because a 5-year-old can't drive a car, right? And it makes sense, right? Because
Sure.
driving a car is a right that comes with responsibilities. In other words, to drive a car, you need to have maturity and have enough self-control to be able to exercise that responsibly, lest if we allowed 5-year-olds to drive cars, obviously they'd run into each other and they'd kill people.
Yeah, famously, one of my friends who was younger when he was in first grade got so mad one day and that he went out to his mom's car and turned it on and released the brake somehow in neutral and crashed into a neighbor's car. Somehow he actually did that when he was only about 5 or 6 years old. So
yeah,
that's not a basic right.
That's right. It's not a basic right, exactly, because you have to enjoy that right. Since the right comes with responsibilities, it's proper to exclude that right from some people if they're unable to exercise those responsibilities, right? So in a similar way, we don't let 5-year-olds vote because we think, look, voting, you have to have, understanding of the community and you have to be able to take responsibility, and 5-year-olds we judge don't have that. But what do I mean by a basic right? By a basic right, I mean a right you have regardless of your ability to discharge responsibilities. So for instance, the right not to be killed. We think that 5-year-olds have that. We think that mentally handicapped people who can never pass a driving exam still have that. The right not to be enslaved, the right not to be tortured. All those things are rights that don't require the one who has the right to exercise any kind of responsibility. So I think that all human beings deserve basic human rights. Now, why do I think that the human newborn, the human fetus, the human embryo is a human being? Well, first of all, this is a living organism of some kind, right? How do we know it's a living organism? Well, we can differentiate living things from non-living things by means of, for instance, the ability to maintain homeostasis, taking in nutrition, the proportionate growth and development. So we have lots of scientific evidence that the human embryo, the human fetus, and the human newborn are living entities. Perhaps the most commonsensical way of thinking about this is that we all recognize that a human newborn can die. But of course, if a thing can die, it has to first be alive, right? Things that aren't alive don't die. You have to be alive to be able to die. So a human newborn is a living entity. It can die, and therefore it's alive. Same thing's true of a human fetus. Same thing's true of a human embryo. These are living organisms. They are capable of dying. And so they are, until they die, living organisms. So that's a scientific point. A second scientific point is, well, these are living creatures of some kind. Well, to what kind do they belong? And I think all available scientific evidence points to the idea that a human newborn, a human fetus, and a human embryo are members of our species. They are human beings. So they have a human mother and a human father. They were created through human reproductive acts, fusing of human gametes together. They have human blood, they have human DNA. They're on the trajectory of growth towards being a mature human being. So there's no evidence at all that the individuals in question are dog embryos, dog fetuses, a cat newborn. There's no evidence at all that they could be any of those things. It's impossible, right, for a human man and a human woman to come together and do reproductive acts and thereby reproduce a cat, dog, fish, tree. That's impossible. That can't happen. So the only kind of thing that they can reproduce through their sexual reproduction is a human being. So all available scientific evidence confirms that the human newborn, the human fetus, and the human embryo are, in fact, human beings. So those are scientific points. The ethical point or the political point would be, should we have an ethics of inclusivity or an ethics of exclusivity? Should we include all human beings, or should we only include those that are like us? Well, that's an ethical question, and that's the question I try to tackle in my book.
I want to follow up on that because that was a great way of putting the point. You say that all human beings deserve basic human rights, and based on the science, the embryo, fetus, and newborn are all human beings. But some people are going to hold, well, I want to modify your thesis. Instead of saying all human beings deserve human rights, I instead want to say maybe all human persons have human rights. And an embryo or a fetus that's only a few weeks old, it might be a human being, but it doesn't rise to the level of being a person. It doesn't have sentience or particular kinds of neuroactivity or the ability to feel pain. So maybe abortion is not wrong in those cases where it's not a person, but it would be wrong in the later stages of development. I think that's a pretty common argument and reply. I'm curious, how do you respond to that?
I think you're right. That is a common kind of reply. And I guess the way I respond to it is when you are selecting what makes the individual a person, what's happening there is an arbitrary selection, both of the criteria that you're using and an arbitrary selection in terms of the degree of the criteria that you're using. So, for instance, Marianne Warren famously puts forward a number of criteria for distinguishing what she thinks of as mere human beings that can be killed and don't have human rights from human beings that are also persons and do have those. And one of those is the ability to communicate. So she wants to say, well, look, we can't have, if the ability to communicate is part of what makes you into a person, you would say that if both of us, since we're having this conversation, we would clearly count as persons, whereas a human fetus can't communicate and therefore does not count as a person. But the question is, well, why should the ability to communicate be necessary in order to be a being that deserves basic respect? A newborn baby can't really communicate, or at least can't communicate an indefinite variety of messages about an indefinite variety of topics. And you might say, well, newborn babies can communicate because they can cry, and that kind of communicates. But if that counts as communication, well, then you have to say, well, every dog has basic rights, right? Every cat has basic rights because they can communicate. In fact, a dog or a cat probably can communicate a wider variety of messages than a newborn baby can. And it doesn't seem to me at all true that the ability to communicate is necessary to be an individual deserving of respect. So think about, say, mentally handicapped adults. Some of those may not be able to communicate, but very few people think that it's okay, for instance, to kill handicapped adults. Or, for instance, think of a mentally handicapped woman who is unable to communicate. Everybody, I hope, would agree that it'd be wrong to rape her. But if it's wrong to rape her, what that means is she has basic rights. And so if she has basic rights, that means that it can't be the case that the ability to communicate is necessary for having basic rights. So I think that the various criteria that are chosen to differentiate mere human beings on the one hand from human persons on the other hand, the criteria are arbitrary. You're choosing ability to communicate rather than the ability to experience pain, let's say. But then they're also arbitrary as to the degree that you need to have. In other words, if you think about communication, that comes in degrees, right? There's very sophisticated, lawyers arguing before the Supreme Court, very high degree of communication. There's little children on the playground, lower degree of communication. There's maybe toddlers that are babbling, even lower degree of communication. So where exactly do you draw the line? It seems entirely arbitrary. And so this is true of whether you're talking about communication, whether you're talking about level of sentience, whether you're talking about the ability to experience pain. All these come in degree, and therefore they're open to the charge of being arbitrary when you have a random cutoff line. And when you're talking about basic human rights, you shouldn't determine who does have those and who does not have those by means of arbitrary, capricious decisions. That's just the very definition of injustice, where just for no good reason, just arbitrary decision, you say, well, you have basic rights and you don't. That is very problematic. And that's exactly what takes place in the discussion about abortion, where arbitrary, randomly chosen characteristics and randomly chosen degrees of those characteristics are chosen. to exclude some human beings from basic human rights.
I think that's an excellent reply. Would it also be possible as another avenue or another point to add on that is to ask them, well, what do you mean by a person? Because we actually think that an embryo would be a person on our a classical definition, at least, of an individual member of a rational kind. I know then you would have to get into different discussions and different accounts of how other people define persons, but would that be another avenue to pursue perhaps in conversation, or do you find that gets too bogged down? I think your way of doing it and pointing out the arbitrary nature of the degrees would get more to the heart of the issue, but I wouldn't want to give up that an embryo or a few week old fetus is a person.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. If you define person as an individual substance of a rational nature, I think you're absolutely right. The human embryo, the human fetus, the human newborn, they all are persons. Now you say, well, why are they persons? How is an embryo or a fetus or a newborn baby rational? Well, clearly a newborn baby, say, is not rational in the sense of exercising rational activity. Just like a human newborn baby is not doesn't have a sexual nature in the sense of having sexual intercourse and reproducing, right? Newborns are too young to do that. But they do have a sexual nature in the sense that a newborn is a female or a male newborn. And the same thing's true of the human fetus, which is already in utero, a male or a female. So you can have a nature that is the interior principles that, if the circumstances are right, give rise to a kind of activity without in the moment being able to exercise that distinctive activity. So what I'd say is all human beings have a rational nature, just as I'd say all human beings have a sexual nature. And it doesn't follow from that all human beings are constantly having sex at all times, nor does it follow that all human beings are constantly doing rational activity at all times. But they're the kind of being, given their nature, that's able to do this. Now, there are exceptions in this sense. You could have a mentally handicapped adult who is unable to do rational activity. Now, does that mean that they don't have a rational nature? I would say no. In fact, we diagnose someone as mentally disabled precisely in virtue of them having a rational nature. In other words, if my dog can't talk, there's nothing wrong with my dog. I said, that's normal. Dogs don't talk. But if my 12-year-old can't talk, something's wrong. There's a problem. In other words, given the nature, given the kind of being that we're talking about, a 12-year-old girl, if she can't talk, something's gone wrong, right? There's some kind of disease, there's some kind of, brain swelling, there's something that's a matter. So we diagnose someone as disabled precisely in virtue of recognizing that they have a rational nature. And therefore we say, oh, this person's intellectually disabled. They've got a rational nature, they had some injury, some accident, they're not able to exercise that nature. And so maybe we work to try to find cures. Whereas again, with the dog, we don't say, oh, there's something gone wrong with the dog can't talk. We recognize the dog does not have an intellectual nature. And so there's nothing wrong at all with a 12-year-old dog who can't talk. Whereas a 12-year-old child who can't talk, we say, oh gosh, the poor boy, the poor girl is disabled. Let's try to help her. Let's try to help him. We'll get them special, tutoring, special, interventions, and hopefully they'll be able to flourish and function in a more rational way. So the rational nature is there, it's recognized, even if the functioning is inhibited either because of youth or because of disability.
No, I think that's a very helpful way to put the point. I want to just ask you one more thing about something you mentioned earlier in the book.
Sure.
And then we'll get to the patron and listener questions who had some really questions about some tough topics and the bodily autonomy arguments and so forth. But you mentioned earlier in this interview the notion of artificial wombs. And I wanted to ask, if artificial wombs exist in the future, would that end the abortion debate? Since then the unborn human being would no longer need to be killed. They could be theoretically placed in this artificial womb and put up for adoption. What do you think about this?
Yeah, that's a good point. My views actually kind of shifted over time. So my original view was that it would fundamentally and radically alter the abortion debate, because a lot of the defenders of abortion, I'm thinking of people like Peter Singer, Judith Jarvis Thompson, David Boonin, and others, have written that if you could just remove the prenatal human being from the woman and put the prenatal human being in an artificial womb, that they would be happy with that. In other words, the right to abortion, on their view, isn't the right to ensure the death of the human being in question. On the other hand, in more recent years, there's been a number of defenders of abortion who have defined abortion as intentionally killing. In other words, they view the right to abortion as not just a right of extraction, but a right of termination of life. And so in the third edition of the book, what I've done is look at least some defenses of this view. And I find those defenses quite weak and wanting. I don't think they really work. But the bottom line is that if artificial wombs do come into existence, I do think it would make some difference for the abortion debate, because there are some people of goodwill who would say, look, I want women to be free of pregnancy. I want women to have autonomy, and women can be free of pregnancy and they can have autonomy by removing the fetus and putting the fetus into the artificial womb. And then women can go on their way and do whatever they want to do. And then there's no killing involved, because the prenatal human being will be in the artificial womb and will be able to be gestated there. And so it could be a win-win. But I'm a little less optimistic than I was, because there are these people who defend abortion as termination of fetal life, not simply removal from the woman.
Okay. Well, with that in mind and our pro-life case made, I want to go to some questions from Paul, Maura, Jordan, and Enrique. And these are going to get into the objections you're going to hear in conversation. Paul actually asked two questions that I think can be dealt with rather briefly, so I'll ask these both. He says, first, what's a good response to the idea that unborn fetuses are like parasites? And then second, he's wondering, what's the most common reason that leads pro-choice folks to become pro-life?
So with the parasite argument, I think that this is unfortunately typical of the ethics of exclusion. So if you look at the way in which different groups have demonized other human groups, it's very common to compare them to parasites, to compare them to insects, to say they're vermin. And it's a way of dehumanizing the individuals involved. This happened obviously in Nazi Germany, right, where they talked about Jews in a very derogatory and dehumanizing sort of way. And so often before people are attacked physically with violence, the group in question is dehumanized. So the fact is that a human fetus, a human embryo, a human newborn is just as human as I am, just as human as you are. They are not a parasite. Now, is it true that the human fetus and the human embryo needs a human being in order to survive? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. If we think about in vitro fertilization, some human beings begin their lives in a petri dish. And so at that point, they are not at all dependent on any individual human being. They could be placed into a whole variety of different women and gestated and brought to birth. If we have artificial uteruses, and again, scientists are working on this in many different countries now, you could have this human being in a created through in vitro fertilization put into the artificial uterus and developed all the way through. So is it true that human beings depend on others for life? Yes, it's true. It's true of the fetus, certainly. It's also true of every human newborn. There's no human newborn that can exist without utter dependence on someone taking care of her, right? No newborn can feed herself, change her own diaper, wrap herself. I mean, obviously. So, the fact that we're dependent on one another is a human reality, certainly at the beginning of life, very often at the end of life, when we become elderly and maybe we have dementia, very often we have to depend on others. And for almost all of us, we depend on others to a greater or lesser degree almost every single day. I mean, very, very few people are utterly independent, grow their own food, make their own clothes,
Right.
I suppose there's some homesteaders or whatever, very rare. The fact is that we as human beings are interdependent. And that shouldn't count against us. That shouldn't be a reason to dislike us or hate us or dehumanize us. To be human is to be interdependent with others. And that's part of the human condition. Alistair McIntyre talked about this as talked about us as being dependent, rational animals. right? And we're dependent on others, whether we're very young, very old, or even in full human maturity. We all depend on others to a greater or lesser degree. And I think that using dehumanizing terms like parasite is quite unfair.
That's
Sorry, the
good.
second,
Second
yeah,
question. Yeah. Do you want me to ask it again? Sorry, I shouldn't have asked two in a row like that. But he
yeah.
just wanted to know what's the common reason. I don't even know if you'll know this off the top of your head, but obviously we'd have to take polls and things. But he says, what's the most common reason that pro-choice folks become pro-life?
Yeah, actually, I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I
Okay.
know it's the case that many, many people do shift their views about this issue. So you have people shifting both ways. You have some politicians like President Clinton and President Biden who were once pro-life, and they shifted to a pro-choice point of view. You have other people like Dr. Bernard Nathanson, who shifted from doing abortions to being very strongly pro-life. Now, he shifted on the basis of the scientific evidence. So in the 70s, ultrasound was introduced, and he could see the ultrasound images. And he came to believe, I think because of the evidence of his own eyes, that this was a living human being. And so I think that the evidence of ultrasound, the photographs of human beings prior to birth, I think that really can move many people, as can the images of what abortions really do. I mean, when you see films like Silent Scream or Clips of Reason, and you see what takes place in an abortion, I think that many people are horrified to realize that abortion really is an act of violence against a vulnerable, dependent human being. And so I think that shifts a lot of people. Obviously, in my book, I'm trying to persuade people that the pro-life view is a view that any person of goodwill, regardless of having faith or not having faith, can embrace. So I think there's a variety of ways that people come to the pro-life view.
Okay. Next up, Maura has two questions as well. And her first one is this: do you have any information or insight on the actual probabilities of a pregnancy being life-threatening these days? Pro-lifers, Maura says, make it sound like these are very rare instances, but the news suggests otherwise.
Yeah, that's a good question. So like all medical procedures, the giving birth has become more and more safe over the last 100 years. So we have superior obstetric techniques today that make it the case that life-threatening situations are much less common. One of the most common situations that happened, 100 years ago was called cephalopelvic disproportion. And that basically means that the baby's head is too big to exit the birth canal. But today what we do is we just do a cesarean section, and that saves the life of the mother and also saves the life of the baby. Now, there are some cases in which the life of the mother is endangered, and I talk about these cases in my book. And my view is that, properly speaking, these cases don't actually involve abortion. If you define abortion, as I do, as intentional killing of a human being prior to birth as a means or as an end. You do have procedures, like a famous case like this would be of a woman with cancer of the uterus, where if she has cancer of the uterus, the doctor might have to remove the uterus in order to prevent the spread of the cancer. Now, if she's pregnant with an early term pregnancy, that removal of the uterus will end up as a side effect, ending in the death of the fetus. But that is not so-called direct abortion. That's not abortion, properly speaking. So a woman whose life is in danger can do anything that she needs to do to ensure that she doesn't die. And doing those procedures is not the same thing as doing an abortion. In other words, I'm not aware of any case in which the death of the human being in question is needed in order to protect the life of the mother. There are procedures like the one I just mentioned, removing a cancerous uterus, where as a side effect, the fetal life is lost, but that is regrettable but ethically acceptable.
Okay, I concur with that. I'm not aware of any case either, though I have heard of some people saying possibly sometimes sepsis or septic, there will be a septic issue in pregnancy where there's an infection and the woman becomes septic such that an abortion could possibly treat that. But I'll just say anecdotally, I have not looked into this a ton. The one time I had heard it, though, it was actually the reason the septic nature was introduced somehow was because of an attempted abortion that had gone wrong. I'm not aware of a case where something naturally happens and the proper treatment is simply to terminate the life of the human being. Like you said, the proper treatment might be to treat the cancer or to remove a portion of the fallopian tube and work on things of that sort. But I'm not aware of a natural condition arising where the proper treatment is simply terminating the pregnancy. But I do want to go to, and you can comment on that if you want, but Maura had another question about the legal aspect. I know your book is on
Sure.
the ethics, but she wanted to know, what do you think about legislation that's drafted to penalize the mother seeking an abortion as well as the doctor? Sometimes this is raised to make the pro-life view look extreme.
Yeah, my own view on the legality of it is that it should be the doctors who are the ones who suffer the legal penalties. And the reason for that is that the doctors are doing a job. They're not under the same kind of duress that a woman in a crisis pregnancy would be under. The doctors have, you might say, a kind of responsibility, given their medical knowledge, to realize that what they're doing is actually intentionally killing an innocent human being. Whereas there be some women that are seeking abortions that don't believe that, don't know that, that's not on their radar, et cetera. So I think that there's really a radical difference between the doctor who, as part of their job, cool, calm, collected, just doing their everyday practice. That seems like a very, very different situation than a woman who's in a crisis pregnancy, who feels panicked, who feels pressured, who's under duress of various kinds. That seems like a very different situation. So yeah, my own view is that it should be only the doctor who is subject to the legal penalties.
Jordan asks about a difficult case, and this hasn't come up yet, but he sketches this out for us. What about a 10-year-old who conceives a child after being raped by her father? Should she be able to remove a 9-week-old fetus from her body? This is how he phrases it, without directly killing the fetus if she doesn't intend for it to die, since she neither consented to the activity which produced it, nor is anyone being directly killed in the process. Rather, the choice is made to refrain from saving the fetus after the fetal human being is removed, nor does she herself believe her to have some natural obligation to the fetus. Now, granted, so that's what Jordan said. Granted, you can talk about this. I don't know if it's medically possible to remove such a young fetus, but if it is medically impossible, then perhaps we could consider the case where if it were possible, or maybe the baby was a little bit older. But how do you analyze these sorts of difficult cases of young rape victims who have the beliefs that Jordan outlined?
Yeah, so I think it would be helpful to take apart the case in the sense of you have kind of a bunch of different things all put together. And that's fine to do that. But I think our thinking will be more clear if we kind of differentiate different aspects to what he's talking about.
Let's do it.
So one aspect I would say is cases of rape and incest. So in a case of rape and incest, I think that we have to be especially compassionate, especially caring, especially helpful to people who've undergone this. In general, we should be for all people that are in a crisis pregnancy situation, but I'd say redouble your efforts, really extra help. A person who's been raped has obviously undergone an unbelievable violation, and it can be very traumatic physically, very traumatic mentally. It's if you think about injustices, it's among the most serious injustices that can be done to someone. And so my view is that we should do whatever we can to prevent that from happening, but also we should do whatever we can to ensure that proper punishment is given to those that commit these terrible crimes. Now, if we're punishing, though, I think we should punish the correct person. So if I do something terrible to you, John, I punch you in the face, it seems to me you're well within your rights to call the police, get me in trouble, or for that matter, to punch me back in the face. Fair enough, right? But if I punch you in the face and then, somebody walks in your room, your wife or whatever, or your friend, and you punch that person in the face, that's a problematic action on your part, right? Why? Well, because I did the violence to you. I did the evil to you. The person who just walked in the room, the innocent person, didn't do anything. So yes, you should be able to use violence against me. So if a woman is getting raped and she has to use violence to stop the rape, she stabs her assailant, more power to her. I mean, that guy should never have done that. But to use violence against an innocent third party is a totally different thing. So I would say that rape is a woman who's able to give life in the case in which she's raped is doing the exact opposite of what the rapist did. So the rapist is doing what? He's taking away freedom. But if a woman gives life in that situation, what is she doing? She's giving someone freedom. A rapist is using his strength to harm someone else. But a woman who gives life in that situation is using her strength to help someone else. The rapist is violating an innocent person. But the woman who gives life in that situation is aiding an innocent person. So there's nothing, I wish we could go in a time machine and undo every rape that ever happened. But of course we can't, there's no time machine. So what we can do though is act in a totally different way than a rapist acts, rejecting, as Kant might say, the maxims of the action of rape. I would say too, that all human beings have equal basic rights, regardless of how they were conceived. So maybe you were conceived, John, in a very beautiful way. You were, your parents it's their 5th wedding anniversary, and they're in the Ritz-Carlton, and there's rose petals around the bed and everything. It's just the most beautiful thing ever. That's fantastic. Other people weren't conceived that way. I was conceived in a way that was, my parents weren't married. It was, didn't know each other that well. And I was the results, I was a crisis pregnancy myself. And so, that's not a great way to start. And then you have an even worse case of someone who gets raped. But my view would be whether you're conceived in the most beautiful way, in a way that was less beautiful, or even in an ugly, terrible way like rape, all of us have equal basic value. And that's regardless of whether we're full-grown adults, whether we're newborns, whether we're in utero, we all have equal basic value. We all have equal basic human rights. So the fact that someone's raped does not mean that the individual child is lacking in basic human rights, on my view. Now, if you had a situation where a pregnancy is threatening the life of the mother, the life of the woman, as I said earlier, all legitimate medical interventions can be done in order to protect her life, excluding, of course, what I regard as not a legitimate medical intervention, intentionally killing as a means or as an end. So if there's some way, if someone's life's endangered, and there's some way that can protect her life, even if, as an unfortunate side effect, it ends up bringing about the death of the fetus, that, in my view, is morally permissible. So think, for instance, we talked earlier about infection. So say some woman has a terrible infection and she's going to die of it. And the doctor's like, well, I've got this super powerful antibiotic. We can give it to you, but as a side effect of you getting the antibiotic, the fetus is going to die. I would say I'm sorry you're in a terrible situation like that, but it's okay, morally speaking, to take the antibiotic, even though you know that as an unfortunate side effect, the human being in utero is going to end up dying. So that's how I would think about the case of rape and the case of life of the mother, that legitimate medical treatments that would be done even if you weren't pregnant can still be done in the case of pregnancy, even if this legitimate medical treatment that you would do even if you weren't pregnant is going to, as a side effect, end up bringing about fetal demise.
That is really helpful analysis. I just want to ask though a little bit further, because Jordan's wondering, I think what he's saying though is, well, what if the victim just wants the really young fetus removed from her? She doesn't want them to go in and dismember it. She doesn't want them to apply chemicals. She just wants it removed. So it's not a direct killing, but she just wants it removed. She didn't consent to this activity, and she doesn't think she has a natural obligation, and she just wants it out of her. How do we think about that?
Yeah, so I think it would So if it's not intentional killing, if that's the right way to describe it, well, then it wouldn't be intrinsically evil. And so it would be something that in principle could be done. So when you think about actions that have two morally significant effects, one way of thinking about those actions is to use double effect reasoning. And one of the principles of double effect reasoning is that there has to be a proportion between the evil that is brought about and the evil that's avoided or the good that's sought. So is the evil brought about significant in this case? Yes, very significant. That is, someone's going to die.
Mm.
And so I would say a proportionate good that's proportionate to that evil would be defending someone else's life. In other words, if the only way for me to survive is to, bring about as a side effect somebody else's death, then I'm justified in doing that. It's regrettable. It's too bad that we're in a situation like that, but that's okay. But if it's a lesser good, then it seems to me that's very questionable whether there's a proportionally serious reason for allowing that evil effect. And so in the case described, I would say, even if it were not intentional killing, it's very questionable and very doubtful, in my view, whether there's a proportionally serious reason for allowing such a significantly evil effect of someone's death.
Okay, I think that's a good answer. And it leads us to our final patron objection, something we talked about earlier. But Enrique asks about bodily autonomy arguments. And he says, I find the following objections to the pro-life case to be the most common. First, the bodily autonomy argument. The unborn has no right to use his mother's body, so the mother can remove him from it, or the violinist argument. And then second, that no one, not even the government, has the right to force women to undergo the pains of pregnancy and labor. So how do you respond to those sorts of arguments? And I know you go into a lot of detail in the book, but give us some of the key highlights.
Yeah, so bodily autonomy obviously is a value and is a real thing, and everybody should enjoy bodily autonomy. But bodily autonomy is limited in all kinds of ways. We do not have legal or moral right to walk around naked, to have sex in public, to urinate in public. There's all kinds of ways in which our bodily autonomy is limited. And the most obvious way is my bodily autonomy is limited by other people's well-being and other people's bodies. So I can't, move my hand around like this and slap people in the face and say, well, it's just my bodily autonomy. It's my body that's like, well, yeah, but there's another person involved, right? So I can't use my body in such a way that it infringes on another person's body. But the case of abortion is exactly like that, right? One person is infringing on another person in terms of the abortion. One person's, so bodily autonomy is limited by the rights of other people. Now, a second point, though, is the case of abortion also is a case in which you have a certain kind of relationship between the woman in question and the human being in question. So what is the relationship? Well, let's think about the man in question. So when a woman is pregnant, sometimes she'll be asked, who is the father? Right? She's not asked, who will the father be? She's asked, who is the father? Why? Well, because there is now a human being that exists, and human beings are mammals, and all mammals have parents. They have a mother and they have a father. So there is a biological father of every pregnancy. And likewise, the woman in question is the gestational mother. Normally, she is also the biological mother, unless she had IV with another person's embryo. But normally, she is also the biological mother. So she is a mother. Now, my view is that biological fathers have very serious duties and responsibilities to use their own bodies to support their own biological dependent children. So I have a duty, for instance, to work and make money and support my own biological children. And likewise, I would say a biological mother has a serious duty to support her own biological dependent children. And this is regardless of whether or not contraception was used. So, maybe you have a guy who goes to a bar and he uses a condom and spermicide jelly, and she says she's on the pill, and they wrap themselves in saran wrap and they do whatever. But if a pregnancy happens, he still has to pay child support. He has to use his own body and do whatever work he does, in order to provide for what the child needs until the child's 18. And I think that is proper and that's good. That's an ethical responsibility. It's a legal responsibility. And so I think also biological mothers have an ethical and legal responsibility to their own biological children. They have a duty to support, promote their own children. So can the government force us to do that? Yes, the government can force us to do that. The government does force us to do that. Outside of abortion, the government forces parents all the time to take care of their children. That's why there's laws against child neglect, right? If I have little kids and I just take off and go to Las Vegas for the weekend and I come back and, one's dead and one's hurt, whatever, I have done something seriously wrong, criminally wrong, and obviously ethically wrong. I have an ethical and legal responsibility to provide what my children need to grow to maturity. And if I fail to do that, I've done something seriously wrong. And the same thing would be true of biological mothers.
Well, Professor Kaiser, I think that is a good response to those bodily autonomy arguments. This has really been an enlightening discussion for me, very helpful. I just wanted to ask you about something in your book in the beginning, actually, the dedication you write, which I found quite touching, for Uma, in great gratitude for carrying an unplanned crisis pregnancy to term and choosing adoption for me. I just wanted to ask you about that as far as what was that like? And has that at all influenced maybe some of your interest in this topic?
Yeah, so I was interested in this topic actually before I knew I was adopted. And so, my views on this, I can't say arise simply because I'm adopted, but I would say that my views have been reinforced by this fact. So my parents, my biological parents, met in the summer of 1968. And in the United States, this is a very tumultuous time, and there was riots and assassinations, and it just was really a tumultuous time. And my father is an immigrant from South Africa. So he's a different race, person of color, and met my Irish American mom. And, one thing led to another, as they say, and she had this unplanned crisis pregnancy. And I have enormous respect for her because it was really a challenge. It was really a difficult situation. And she had the courage and the love for me to place me for adoption. And I was adopted into a very loving and wonderful family. And I've got the chance after in many years to reconnect with my birth mother. And it's been a beautiful thing. In fact, I just saw her last weekend. So, to reconnect with her and really to express my gratitude to her, because I now realize, this is a difficult situation and there's no minimizing it. But sometimes heroism is difficult, right? I mean, that's why we respect heroes, because they do something really tough and they do something difficult. And for me, it does make the abortion issue more real, because when you're talking about a crisis, unplanned pregnancy and unwanted pregnancy, you're talking about actual individuals like me. This is not an abstraction. This is not, you're talking about flesh and blood individual human beings like me. And so, I'm very grateful to her. And I guess, part of what animates my desire to talk about this issue is the desire that all human beings like me to receive fundamental protection, to receive what they need to grow and to love and to have the chance for a valuable future. So I'm very grateful to her. And so I thought it was appropriate to dedicate the book to her.
Well, that's a beautiful story, and I think a great note to end on. Thank you for sharing that. Christopher Kaiser, thank you for joining us today on the Classical Theism podcast. Just let listeners know a little bit more about where they can go to find out about your work, anything else you want to tell us about this upcoming book, and feel free to point to any links or anything of that sort before we say goodbye.
Thanks. Well, I am on Twitter, Prof_Kaiser. Is my handle at Twitter, and I'm on Facebook. So if people want to look me up or friend me, that's great. The book is the third edition of The Ethics of Abortion, Women's Rights, Human Life, and the Question of Justice. And I'm really excited about it because of all the works I've done, I'd say for sure this one is the one I put my heart in the most. I worked on it for 10 years for the first edition, and I've kind of kept at it and kept up to date in terms of all the scholarly literature and debates on the topic. So I really do think it's the best book I've done, at least, and I hope it's beneficial for other people too.
Fantastic. Well, I will make sure to link to that book and other resources in the show notes page. But thanks again for joining us today. It's been a blast.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.